We're going to continue on in our study of this topic of love that we have now spent. This will be 4 weeks. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where we're going to wrap up and kind of round out this conversation about love. We are obviously not just breezing through this chapter as we very easily could have, because the topic is incredibly important. If you're here today and you're here not because you go to church, this isn't your kind of normal everyday Sunday morning, but you're here because you came with mom, or you came because of mom or something, and maybe you're here, you wouldn't even identify yourself as a Christian, and you might find it very refreshing that you go to church and hear him talking about something that you think Christians ought to get a grip on, and that is what it means to be people of love. If there is anything that Christianity ought to be known for, it's the way that Christians demonstrate love for one another and love for the world around them. Unfortunately, many of us know and can acknowledge that that hasn't always been the case. And so a few weeks ago, we started off in this chapter by talking about the priority of love, how we could be full of any number of things or capable of any number of things, but if we don't have love, they are rendered ineffective and useless. And then we spent a couple of weeks talking about all the different facets of love, the meaning, how love is defined by the Apostle Paul in this chapter. And today I want to talk about the greatness and the permanence of love. So 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we're going to start in verse 8 with love never ends. And if the only time you've ever heard anything from this chapter read was at a wedding, there's a good chance that's where it finished, right? The person that's officiating the service or some other person that's participating in the service reads through this chapter and gets to the point where it says, love never ends, and then that's it, and they move on. But there's more to it. Paul says, love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. Here he says, why? For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. For now, we see only a reflection as in a mirror, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. Now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. How would you finish this statement? It would be great if it would be great if I could. How would you finish that? Or it would be great if I only had. It'd be great if I knew. How do you measure greatness? What is it that makes you great? Because I know you're great. You know you're great. You're not going to admit that you're great, but you know you're great. How is that greatness measured? Or how is your importance measured? Is it measured by the amount of money that you have? By the amount of things that you have accumulated? Is your greatness measured by your influence or by your power? Is your importance, is your greatness measured by maybe some just incredible talent that you have? In Corinth, this ancient city that had a church to whom this letter was written nearly 2,000 years ago, they felt that they were pretty great. We've spent months talking about the various facets of how they defined and described their greatness. Let me just walk very quickly through some of those things. For one, they had their people. They had their tribe. They had their guy. And as a part of that group, part of the following of that guy, they thought they were great. They thought they had reached the top of the mountain when it came to wisdom. They thought themselves very, very wise, a wise group of people. They had risen up out of the wretched conditions that a lot of early Christians found themselves in the early days. They became distinguished in Corinth. They became prominent. They became important, like people who were ready to rule. Curiously, they had freed themselves from an attachment to their physical bodies, which allowed them to pursue the immoralities that were part of their former lives and even permit immoralities that went beyond what was acceptable in polite society, because they became sophisticated. And so they were great. They weren't afraid to be petty when life called for pettiness. If they had been wronged or harmed in any way, then you better believe they'd get their day in court, and they would get their own. They were free to do as they pleased without concerning themselves with how their living affected others. And they had the Spirit of God among them. Their worship was vibrant, ecstatic. It was so showy, you'd have a hard time keeping up with everything that was going on. And by all this, they measured themselves as being great. All they were missing was just one thing. All they were missing was just one thing. And Paul here wants them to know that everything they thought that made them important, everything that made them think they had ascended to the top, everything that they thought distinguished them was going to fade away. That a time would come when all of that which they used to measure their importance, to measure their greatness, it would be gone. And the one thing they were missing was the one thing that lasts forever. I'll bet you can guess what that thing is. It's love. Agape love, unconditional love, the kind of love that God perfectly demonstrates for us and calls each of us into a life of living as well. Paul says here of this love, he says, love never fails. Love never fails, which I think falls a little short of really helping us to understand what Paul is trying to get across. The word that we translate fails in some of our translation literally means love never falls. Love never falls. Like, I was thinking how a leaf falls from a tree, right? Every year, as the seasons change, the leaves fall. So that leaf, it falls from the tree and it, in essence, loses its life. It dries out and fades away. Right? It begins to disintegrate. Not fast enough, which is why we have to clean up all our leaves. And so what Paul is describing here is that these things that we once considered to be so substantial and so important, they will shrivel up into relatively nothing. Figuratively speaking, what Paul is trying to get across here is that love will never be deprived of its force. Do you know that love has a force to it? And Paul says that the one unique thing about love is that it will never be deprived of its force. We have come to know some things about energy. That is that, maybe you remember learning this in some of your science classes in school, but every time energy is transformed from one form to another, what happens? Some of that energy is lost, right? Like you don't maintain 100% of that energy potential. That potential energy, as it is transformed, some of it is lost. The gas that we put in our cars, it has energy content in it. But our cars are actually only able to use about 20% of the energy from our gasoline. The rest of it is lost. Think about all the things that we do. Think about all the ways that we're spending our energy. How many of you are spending a lot of energy? Like every day. Just, especially depending on the season of life you're in. It could be go, 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 go. Just like this constant striving in this world, right? Think of all the ways that we are spending our energy, and so much of it is lost, isn't it? Just think about your paycheck. Imagine if you could keep the full power of your paycheck. I mean, we look at your pay stub recently. What happens, right? You made this much money. You didn't get that much money, did you? No, because there's this tax and that tax and this tax and that tax, right? So 100% of that, what you have put your energy into, it's been lost. It's gone before you've even gotten your hands on it. Its force is reduced by all kinds of taxes. We live in a world where nothing is really permanent, right? We're constantly throwing things away. We're constantly having to consider whether something is worth keeping. We're constantly replacing things that have worn out. Like, wouldn't it be nice if, as long as I have bought this thing, that's the last time I'll have to buy that thing for the rest of my life? That doesn't happen. No, it wears out. And so what do? Well, I continue to pour out more energy to replace that thing that's been lost. And on and on and on and on it goes. The fact that we live inside of this thing called time means that there is constant change and transition, and there's a disintegration of the things, even the things that we think are really, really important. But what never disintegrates, this is what Paul's getting at, what never disintegrates is love. That's the one thing that will never be deprived of its force. While people can create electricity in power plants and then transmit that electricity all the way into our homes, along the way, some of that energy is lost, right, through that transmission. But love will never be deprived of its full power. Love remains constant at 100%. It will never be deprived of its force. What's so important for us to understand about love is that the love that you and I show to one another will never be depleted. Its force will remain forever, whether or not we can see it. How many of you know that a lot of times when we love, we don't necessarily see something directly come out of that? But we never have to wrestle with, we never have to wonder, was it worth loving this person? Was it worth showing love in this particular situation? Because, from my perspective, all I can see is a loss of return, right? But as soon as we start to think that way, now we're not talking about love exactly, right? Because if love is actually unconditional, that is, love doesn't require any kind of reciprocal action. It doesn't require any kind of transactional exchange. I can be confident that merely acting out and expressing love, the force of that love, whether I can see it or not, will always remain at 100% and forever. The author Paul, he gives some examples here. He says, but as for prophecies, like he speaks particularly to the character of the gifts that God has given to the church for its building up, for its edification. He says, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. Now, one of the most important things that I do is preach, right? Because that's my job. You might not think it's important, but it's one of the most important things that I do. However, everything that I've preached, everything I've ever taught is going to come to an end, right? It's like that leaf that falls from the tree. It's not the preaching that I have done in my life that is going to endure out through this life and into the world that's to come. Why? Well, because at the end of time, God will have revealed everything. You see, what we are doing here week to week, whether it's I'm preaching a message or you're opening up God's word and studying a passage of scripture or listening to a podcast or some other kind of thing, but simply like the digesting of material for our spiritual benefit. Like we do that because we don't know everything, right? And we'll get to that. Like we're still learning, we're still growing, but there's going to come a point where God will have revealed everything. He will have evaluated everything. He will have pronounced judgment on everything, and there will be nothing left for the prophet to say. You see, we live in an era where, well, there's still something to say. We're all making our way through this life like people who make their way through the darkness with flashlights. Everything that we're striving for amounts to managing the energy of those flashlights, constantly having to change the batteries. But eventually we're going to live in the noonday sun, as it were, where flashlights won't matter anymore. At that point, how much money I made won't matter. The highest rank that I reached to in my company won't matter. My successful business, it won't matter. How much people looked up to me, it won't matter. How many followers I have on social media, it won't matter. Only acts of love will remain in the brightness of the sun. All those other things would be like just carrying our flashlights into the middle of the day when the sun is already shining. Paul goes on to say, for we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will come to an end. When he talks about these things being in part, what he means is that they come to us bit by bit. Martin Luther, the 16th century reformer, described it as something like, when it comes to our knowledge is like patchwork, right? It's bit by bit. It's in part and not fully complete. None of us possesses a full and complete understanding of all things. What we're actually doing is, those of us who are engaged in the process, we're building up our knowledge. But the way that we're doing it, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, this is just, I think the way that I think sort of best describes how we're going about it, and that is we're Mickey Mousing it together. Any of you ever Mickey Mouse something to get it to work? Right? You fabricated something in order to get the job done. Well, there are those who feel like they possess such a high degree of knowledge And that high degree of knowledge that they think they have attained, it leads to their own pride and arrogance. And Paul says, no, you don't understand. We know in part, bit by bit, like patchwork. We're Mickey Mousing this thing together. Now, again, I don't say that disrespectfully or in a way to make it sound like how we are growing in our knowledge of the things of God is unimportant. It's incredibly important. And you don't Mickey Mouse something together in order for it to be dysfunctional, right? You Mickey Mouse it together to make it work, and that's what we're doing. We take all of what we are growing in and what we are learning and what we are experiencing. We evaluate it according to what God has revealed to us through his word. We share it with one another in spiritual community, through conversations, through acts and demonstrations and gestures of love and spiritual formation. We listen to the proclamation of the word, and then we weigh and we balance it to determine if it has any weight and substance to it, right? And then we add it into this thing that we are growing in. And it works. Like we actually have the ability to come to a place where we have while it's obscured to some degree, while, like as Paul is going to describe it, we see dimly and not perfectly, we can actually cobble something together that works, that makes sense, that lines up with our understanding of reality. And the reason is because, well, God has given us enough to be able to do that. We talked about how God has given gifts to his church. The reason why he is giving gifts to the church is because we are incomplete. And we've spent 30-something weeks now talking about how as a church we're incomplete and imperfect, messy, if you will. We are exactly in the place of needing to be built up. This is why you don't walk into a finished church. You don't walk into an established church that's made up of finished people. Like there's no such thing. That doesn't exist. Because we're not finished people. Rather, we are people that are being built up. A mother says to her newborn, "You are perfect in every way." Right? As she looks into the eyes of that baby and plays with its fingers and its toes, traces the contours of its body. But in her expression of, this child is perfect in every way, she doesn't neglect feeding the baby. She marvels at how the baby grows. She marvels at the development of this child, but she knows that she has to help it develop. Help it develop things like motor skills, learn how to regulate itself in its emotional responses, right? This is what it means that adults build up a child. And so you and I, we are like that. We are in need of being built up. The mistake that some make when it comes to this life is that this is my completed form. And you can find this outside of the church for sure, and you can find it inside of the church as well. You can find those who have resigned themselves to the idea that, well, this is who I am, or this is what I am. This is me in my completed form. No real serious follower of Jesus has ever thought, there isn't really anything new that's worth my doing, and there isn't really anything new worth doing in me. Verse 12, Paul says, "For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully as I am fully known." We see only a reflection. Now, what's important for us to understand is what Paul is not saying. He's not saying that all we see is a distortion. I think it's an unfortunate and even corrupted view of what it is that we can know, to simply resign ourselves to, well, it's all just a distortion. And there's nothing that I can really ever be fully assured of. And so, well, let me just throw my hands up and say, well, why bother? What Paul really means is that it's just we see partially, not completely, but we see enough. We see enough to make it worth the time that we pour into growing in our understanding of the things of God. We just have to understand that it isn't like the real thing. How many of you ever seen a photograph of the Grand Canyon, but you've never been to the Grand Canyon? You're like me. Right? And what do all the people who have been to the Grand Canyon say when you show them a beautiful picture of the Grand Canyon? It's not the same as going there, right? And I'll bet that's true, right? Paul says, one day we will see face to face. And then he closes this out by saying, now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. So Paul has now demonstrated for the church in Corinth how, while they have understood their prominence and their importance and their greatness as being measured by all these various things, Paul says what it really comes down to is love. How you express God's love. He says these three things remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Love transcends even things like faith and hope, right? Because while in this time we live by faith, as Karl Barth said, faith eventually becomes assimilated into sight. One day we're going to see, and faith is no longer going to be required. Today we hope, but one day there will be nothing for us to hope in, because hope will be absorbed into that which is perfect. Love, though, love and its concern for the other will never become obsolete. So here's our choice. Our choice is that we face and we live in a world that is transactional in nature, right? I do things for a return. You do things for a return. Here's how I can go about living in this transactional world. I can go to work for a paycheck. I could do that. I could invest so that I make a return in the future. But let me ask you something. You go to a restaurant. Who do you want to serve you at that restaurant? Do you want the person who's serving you to see you as a transaction? Do you want the person who's serving you to be motivated merely by the tip that they hope that you're going to give him or her? Or do you want to be served by someone who wants to serve you? To make your experience one where you feel like you're living like kings and queens. There's a big difference between those two, right? Who would you want preaching to you on a Sunday? If you had to listen to someone preach to you on a Sunday. Don't answer that out loud. No, seriously, do you want the person that's preaching to you, do you want that person to see you as a butt in a seat? To see you as a statistical measure of importance? To see you as a necessary participant so that the preacher still has a job tomorrow? And so let me reframe how I can live in this world. So I can go to work in return for a paycheck, right? And I can do that. I could probably get away with that for a pretty long time. Or I can go to work as a means of loving my world the best way I know how. I can invest so that I make a return in the future. Good for me and Renee. Or I can invest as a means of living my days out generously toward others. Right? So that's me, that's my world. Now you. How will love change the way you see your work? How will love change the way you're planning for the future, or how maybe you're already kind of living in the future? Let me ask the question I asked in the beginning. What is it that makes you important? Is it money? Is it stuff? Is it influence or power? Is it some kind of talent? Or is what makes you important the way you're spending your life out in love toward others? Can you imagine, what if we all lived like everything that we're burning up our energy for was only going to last for a minute? I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of things we have to burn up our energy for. That's what life requires of us. We have to spend our energy. That's what it means to be alive. But what if we actually had a transformation of our perspective on everything? Where all of the things that I was burning up my energy for, all the things that you were burning up your energy for, we knew those things were just going to last for a minute. And the only thing that we could do that would last forever was to love each other. What would that look like? What would it look like if we actually believed, if we actually understood, if we actually lived out? You know, the only thing that I can do that's going to last forever is to love others.